There is a ledger in the archives of the New York Foundling Hospital that lists children by number, not by name. The name column exists, printed on the form, allocated its own ruled space, but across dozens of entries from the 1870s and 1880s that column is blank or crossed through, or filled with a name that contradicts the intake record filed 3 pages earlier. What is consistent, entry after entry, is the number. The number was always precise. The name was frequently uncertain. That asymmetry is not a clerical accident. It is the signature of a system that was built around the act of placement and never around the act of memory. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were transported from the northeastern cities of the United States to rural communities across the Midwest and the West. The trains departed from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. They arrived in Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, Texas, and dozens of other states. Children from the tenements of Lower Manhattan were placed on farms in counties that had no record of their existence before the train pulled into the depot. Charles Loring Brace founded the Children's Aid Society in New York City in 1853. He was 26 years old and recently graduated from Yale Divinity School. What he documented in the streets around Five Points and the Lower East Side confirmed what other reformers of the period were also observing. A city absorbing more immigrant labour than its housing and labour markets could accommodate, producing visible child poverty on a scale that no private charity had yet organised a response to. Brace estimated in his 1872 book The Dangerous Classes of New York that approximately 30,000 children were living in conditions of near homelessness in the city's poorest neighbourhoods in the early 1850s. Contemporary critics disputed his methodology. No one disputed the streets. His solution was geographic, not institutional reform, not family support, relocation, move. The children west, into the labour-absorbing economies of rural America, where a strong child of 10 or 12 was understood as a practical resource, and a farming household might have the physical and financial capacity to absorb one more person that a Manhattan tenement absolutely did not. The trains ran on published schedules, coordinated through local church contacts and county agents who prearranged receiving families before departure. The programme carried the organised appearance of social welfare. Consider the math. A child placed in 1875 at age 8 would have been 83 years old in 1950. Their grandchildren, born in the 1920s and 1930s, grew up hearing stories from someone who had stood on a depot platform in a town they had never seen, and been chosen or not chosen by strangers who walked the line evaluating their apparent capacity for field labour. Those grandchildren are in their 80s and 90s today. A few may still be living. The oral record is almost gone. What passed down through those families, or when anything passed at all, often arrived without surnames, without origin cities, without the names of siblings who had been placed in different counties on the same afternoon. The connection to whatever came before the train existed only in memory, and memory, in many of these households, had been discouraged. The receiving end of the programme did not resemble what the rescue literature described. At stops along the routes, courthouses, church halls, town squares, the children were displayed for inspection. Contemporary accounts, including reports filed by the placing agents themselves, describe farmers and townspeople walking down the line, examining hands for calluses, assessing apparent physical strength, selecting the children they judged most useful. Families indicated their preferences. Children who were not selected reboarded the train and continued to the next stop. The word used in official documentation is placed. The word used in some contemporary accounts is chosen, which implies, without stating, that others were not. Less than half of the 250,000 transported children were, by any documented evidence, actual orphans. The remainder were children of immigrants who could not afford to keep them, children surrendered under economic pressure, children removed from families by city institutions that had judged the home environment inadequate, and children who still had at least one living parent somewhere in the same city. The Children's Aid Society's own records acknowledge this plainly. Brace wrote that the goal was not exclusively to serve children with no families, but to serve children who were, in his phrase, in danger. That phrase did considerable institutional work. It covered nearly any child whose family circumstances a placement agent found unsatisfactory. The New York Foundling Hospital, established in 1869 by the Sisters of Charity, operated its own parallel program, under different organisational logic, placing children, many of them surrendered infants, through Catholic parish networks in rural communities. Together, these two institutions and the smaller societies working in their orbit moved 250,000 children across 7 decades. The official framing, consistent across annual reports and fundraising materials and contemporary newspaper coverage, was salvation. Children removed from danger and delivered to wholesome rural homes. What the programme's founders did not design for, what no document in any surviving archive suggests anyone considered designing for, was the preservation of who these children had been before they boarded the train. The intake form captured the departure. Nothing was built to capture what happened to the name after arrival. That was not an oversight. The renaming began almost immediately after placement. In some cases, it happened before the train reached its first stop. Agents travelling with the children note in filed placement summaries that children carrying difficult foreign surnames were encouraged to adopt simpler ones before arrival at the first depot. Irish names were anglicised. Polish and German surnames were shortened or replaced. The reasoning offered in internal correspondence was practical. A child with an unpronounceable surname would face more resistance from rural families evaluating their options at a depot display. The child's past was an obstacle to placement, and placement was the only function the system had been built to perform. What happened to the original name afterward was not tracked. The intake form completed at departure in New York recorded one name. The receiving agent's ledger, when one was completed at all, recorded whatever name the child was using upon arrival at the destination town. No mechanism connected the two documents. The Children's Aid Society maintained departure records in its New York offices. The receiving agent, of her county official, a church contact, or a trusted local farmer, kept whatever records seemed appropriate in whatever format stored wherever space existed. No standardized form was required at the receiving end until the movement's final decades. Many of those records no longer exist. The sibling problem is worse. The placement system imposed no formal requirement that brothers and sisters be kept together. Placements were made by household availability and the preferences of receiving families, not by family unit. A farming household in Iowa might request a boy between 10 and 14 capable of field work. A town family in Missouri might request a girl of 12 to assist with domestic duties. If 3 siblings arrived at a depot, 2 boys and a girl, the available requests might separate them across 3 different counties, 3 different families, and 3 different surnames on the same afternoon. The separation was not recorded as separation. Each placement was recorded individually as a successful outcome. Neither the departure records nor the receiving records acknowledged that the children had arrived together. Consider the arithmetic. A child of 7 placed in rural Nebraska in 1895 would have been in her mid-40s in 1933, the year the 1890 census was authorized for destruction. Her children, born in the 1910s and 1920s, were old enough by the 1930s to ask where she came from. She would have had no reliable answer, not because she refused to tell them, because the chain of documentation connecting her to any identity before the train had been severed at every transfer point, and she had been a child when the severing happened. Researchers who examined surviving placement files in the late 20th century documented cases in which children from the same biological family were placed in different states with no cross-reference in either file indicating the existence of the sibling. The connection had not been suppressed. It had simply never been written down. The official explanation for these documentary gaps has always been scale and underfunding. The Children's Aid Society placed children across 47 states and territories over 75 years. Records were imperfect because the institutions were imperfect. Reasonable, except for one detail the surviving documents consistently confirm. The record-keeping was not uniformly poor. Intake records filed by paid staff in New York are frequently detailed, legible, and cross-referenced. The deterioration is located almost entirely at the receiving end, the moment the child passed from institutional supervision into the custody of a local agent and a rural household. The information loss was structurally positioned at the point of least oversight. Not an accident, an architecture. And then there is the federal document that would have made retrospective tracing possible. The 1890 census was the most detailed population survey the United States had ever conducted. Each household was asked to record immigration status, naturalization details, English language proficiency, and length of U.S. residence. A child placed in Kansas in 1882 under a new surname would have appeared in that census, located, named, traceable to a county and a household. It would not have restored her origins, but it would have preserved a thread. That census existed in one location, the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington. No backup had been filed at county level, breaking a protocol observed without exception since 1790. On January 10th, 1921, a fire destroyed roughly a quarter of the records outright and damaged another half with water and smoke. The surviving portion sat in a warehouse for 12 years without restoration. In February 1933, Congress authorized destruction of what remained. The thread was cut. The timeline, placed in sequence without commentary, holds a particular weight. 1854, the Children's Aid Society places the first children on westbound trains. The movement grows through the 1860s and 1870s, reaching its highest volume in the decades when American cities are absorbing the largest waves of immigrant labor in the nation's history. 1890. The federal government conducts its most detailed census, the one document capable of locating placed children by name, by household, by county, in a single, searchable federal record. That census is stored without backup in a single building in Washington, breaking a protocol observed without exception since 1790. 1921. Fire damages roughly 3/4 of the records through burning, water and smoke. 1929. The Orphan Train stopped running. 1933. The surviving census records are authorized for destruction and eliminated. 1936. The Federal Writers' Project begins interviewing the last Americans old enough to carry first-hand memory of the transition period. 1939. The project is defunded. By the time the last orphan train riders were elderly, speaking, remembering, still reachable, the documentary chain connecting them to their origins had been severed at every link. Not by a single catastrophic event, by sequence. Departure records held in New York, receiving records held locally, incompletely, by individuals with no reporting obligation. Placement outcomes never confirmed to the originating organization once the child had been transferred to a household. The 1890 census destroyed by fire, then neglect, then authorized elimination. Each step unremarkable in isolation. Together, they formed something harder to set aside. There were children on those trains who arrived at their destinations and were told not to speak of where they had come from. Some were given new first names as well as new surnames. Some were informed their parents were deceased when, according to surviving intake records, both parents had been alive at the time of departure. Some were moved a second time, transferred from one household to another, when the first placement failed and the second relocation generated no documentation because the original organization had already closed the file. These children could not tell their grandchildren where they came from, not because they refused, because the system had consumed the information before they were old enough to understand what they had lost. The same generation that watched the orphan trains run also watched the White City rise in Chicago in 1893. 200 monumental neoclassical structures built across 630 acres of Jackson Park, visited by 27 million people in 6 months, then demolished. Architecture and identity, both removed within the same window by separate institutions producing identical outcomes. What existed before the transition, the names, the buildings, the records, did not survive into the century that followed. What replaced it was a different kind of continuity. One without the evidence of its own origins. What remains is partial. The New York Foundling Hospital retained surviving ledgers accessible to researchers who know to request them. The Children's Aid Society records held at the University of Minnesota cover departures with variable completeness. State-level receiving documentation survived in Kansas, Iowa, and Missouri with better continuity than most. These records are what the archive holds. Researchers who know to ask can find threads. Some threads lead somewhere, many do not. DNA testing has allowed some descendants to locate biological relatives across the Orphan Train divide. A surname cluster surfaces in Nebraska, with no paper trail before 1903. A second cousin match emerges whose family records terminated an informal placement in the same county the same decade. The biological connection exists in the genetics. The documentary connection that would explain it does not exist anywhere. That gap is where most of those 250,000 histories now reside. You may be descended from someone placed on one of those, Trains. You would likely never know. The surname you carry might be the name a placement agent wrote onto a ledger in 1891, chosen because it was manageable to a county registrar and asked no further questions. The name the child carried onto the train, the name that belonged to a family, a neighbourhood, a language, may exist on a single intake form in a partial archive in Manhattan, or it may not exist anywhere at all. The ledger in the New York Foundling Hospital archive, the one with the number column precise and the name column crossed out, is still there. The crossed out entry has not been restored. The number written above it has not been traced to a corresponding departure record in any publicly accessible index. The form is readable. The connection it cannot make is also readable, in the space where the name used to be. The archive holds what it holds. What it doesn't hold is louder.